In the heart of a small, unsuspecting African village, a chilling secret lurked behind the veil of respectability. A man, once thought to be a pillar of the community, harbored a dark and twisted desire, one that would bring him untold wealth, but at an unimaginable cost. The villagers trusted him, admired him, and never suspected that his wealth came at the price of the most horrifying crime a parent could commit. What they didn't know was that he was using his own children to unlock the riches he desired, believing it would remain a secret forever. But as the forces of fate began to unravel, the truth was about to shock everyone. In a small, quiet village nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, lived a man named Duro. He was well known and highly respected within the community for his agricultural expertise. He had a sprawling farm where crops flourished, and his cattle grazed contentedly under the African sun. His home was humble, but he kept it well maintained, and his family appeared to be the epitome of happiness and health. Duro, his wife, and their 3 children were considered the ideal family. They worked together, loved each other, and were looked up to by many in the village. But there was a darkness that lay hidden behind Duro's success, something that none of the villagers could have imagined. Beneath his calm exterior and his warm smile, Duro harbored an insatiable hunger for wealth. It wasn't enough for him to merely live comfortably, he wanted to be the wealthiest man in the village. He dreamed of endless riches and treasures beyond what any farmer in his village had ever seen. It was a desire that gnawed at him day and night, until it became an obsession. His life, which had once been content, had begun to revolve around this one dark ambition. One day, as Duro sat alone in his home, deep in thought about how he could increase his wealth, a mysterious figure appeared at his door. She was an old woman, her face covered by a veil, and her presence had an aura of ancient wisdom. She introduced herself as Mama Titi, a traveler from the distant regions of the land. She claimed to be a wise woman who had traveled the world and encountered many powerful forces. She promised Duro that she could help him achieve his goal of becoming extraordinarily rich. But, she cautioned, the price would be high. Mama Titi's eyes gleamed with an otherworldly understanding, and Duro, captivated by her presence, listened closely to her offer. She spoke of an ancient ritual that could bring him the wealth he so desperately desired. The ritual required a sacrifice, something precious, something irreplaceable. She didn't specify what the sacrifice would be, but Duro, blinded by his desire for riches, was eager to proceed. He agreed without hesitation. Mama Titi gave him instructions on what he needed to do to prepare for the ritual. She told him that the ritual could only be performed under the full moon, when the forces of nature were at their most potent. The sacrifice would need to come from his own family, someone dear to him, someone he loved. Duro, though struck by the strangeness of her words, did not hesitate. He was willing to do anything for the wealth he had always dreamed of. The day of the full moon arrived, and Duro found himself at a crossroads. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on him, but the temptation of wealth was too great. His children, whom he loved dearly, were blissfully unaware of the darkness that had begun to consume their father. They were just children, full of joy and laughter, oblivious to the terrible secret their father was about to enact. Duro looked at his wife, Nia, who had never questioned his decisions. She trusted him completely, and her love for him was unquestioning. She would never suspect that the man she had married, the father of their children, could commit such an unspeakable act. She was completely unaware of the dangerous path Duro was about to take. But Duro knew what he had to do. The ritual would require a child, his own child. It would not be enough to sacrifice livestock or material wealth. To fulfill the bargain and gain the power that Mama Titi had promised, he needed to give up something far more precious. It would have to be his child, his flesh and blood. The enormity of what he was about to do began to weigh on him, but he pushed the thought aside. After all, once he had the wealth, he would be able to buy back anything he needed, including his soul. As night fell and the village quieted, Duro made preparations for the ritual. He gathered his children and told them they were to go to bed early that evening. They had no idea that this night would be different. They had no idea that this would be the last night of innocence they would experience. As the full moon rose high in the sky, Duro stood alone in the clearing behind his house, clutching the ancient dagger Momatiti had given him. The ritual was simple, but its consequences were far from clear. He could feel the tension in the air, as if the very ground beneath his feet were holding its breath. The silence was deafening, and in that moment, he knew that there was no turning back. But even as he raised the dagger, ready to do what he had convinced himself was necessary, something stirred inside him, a brief flicker of doubt. He hesitated, just for a moment, wondering if what he was doing was truly right. But that fleeting doubt quickly disappeared as the promise of untold riches flooded his mind once again. This was his only chance. This was the price for everything he had ever wanted. Just as he was about to follow through with the ritual, a sharp cry echoed from within his home. It was the voice of his youngest child, a small boy named Kofi. The cry cut through the silence like a knife, and Duro's heart skipped a beat. He had not expected his child to wake at this hour, and the sound of his voice sent a rush of panic through his body. Duro hesitated, but before he could move, the air around him began to grow heavy. The full moon shone brighter than ever before, casting an eerie glow across the clearing. And in that moment, a voice, deep, otherworldly, and full of ancient power, spoke from the darkness. "You cannot undo what has already begun, Duro. The price has been set. There is no turning back now." The voice was not Momatiti's, but something far older, far more powerful. It was the voice of the spirit to whom Duro had offered his soul. The weight of his decision hit him like a hammer. His attempt to stop the ritual was futile. The forces of the spirit world were already in motion. At that moment, Duro knew he had already made his choice, and he would live with the consequences forever. In this first section, the foundation is set for a story of forbidden desires, powerful forces beyond human comprehension, and the terrible consequences of greed. Duro's actions will inevitably lead to the unraveling of his life, but the true horror has yet to come. The spirit's voice and the dark pact Duro has made will set in motion a series of events that will forever change his fate and the fate of those he loves. The next day, the weight of Duro's decision hung heavily over him, like a shadow that refused to be shaken. His mind was in turmoil, yet the path he had chosen was now set in motion. The moon had risen high, and its silvery glow cast a haunting light over the village as Duro walked back into his home. He could feel the eyes of his children upon him, their innocent gaze unaware of the horrors unfolding just beneath the surface of their lives. They were unaware of the dark pact their father had made, unaware of the invisible thread that bound them to the spirit world. Duro tried to push aside the rising doubts within him as he entered the house, but they crept back in every corner of his mind. The air in the house felt oppressive, like a fog that wouldn't lift. His wife, Nia, noticed the distant look in his eyes, the hollow expression that seemed to have replaced the warmth he once had. She had known Duro for years, and though their marriage had seen its fair share of ups and downs, she never imagined that her husband would harbor such a deep secret. She noticed his restless demeanor, his fidgeting hands, and the tension in his voice when he spoke. But she brushed it aside, attributing it to the stress of the harvest season and the growing responsibilities of the farm. Nia was busy with the household chores, tending to the younger children, unaware that the man she loved was standing at the precipice of an unimaginable choice. The atmosphere in the home was heavy, and despite the warmth of the fire flickering in the hearth, the chill of dread seemed to fill every corner of their modest dwelling. Adoma, the youngest child, sat quietly by the window, her small hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the outside world. Turned, her older brother, was playing with his toys in the corner, but there was an unease in his eyes, a restlessness he could not shake. He had been distant lately, quiet, and preoccupied. Ton had always been perceptive, but in the days leading up to the ritual, something had changed within him. He had seen the change in his father's demeanor. His once loving eyes had turned cold, and his hands trembled when he touched his children. Ton had overheard snippets of strange conversations late at night, when his parents thought he was asleep. He had heard the strange whispers, the words he couldn't quite understand. The unease had settled deep within him, but he couldn't find the courage to ask his father what was truly happening. As the sun set and the shadows grew longer, Duro could no longer ignore the presence of the coffin that sat in the corner of the room, waiting to be acknowledged. The wooden box, which had come into being through the ritual, lay dormant in the center of the room. The carving of intricate symbols along its surface glistened in the firelight, and the air around it felt thick with dark energy. It was a symbol of the price he had paid, a price that could never be undone. Duro could feel the spirits watching him, urging him to complete the task. The pact was not finished, and the coffin was the vessel through which the spirit's power would flow. Despite the guilt gnawing at his soul, Duro couldn't shake the urge to touch the coffin. He felt drawn to it, the pull of its power becoming stronger with each passing hour. The thought of wealth, of living a life beyond his wildest dreams, consumed him. But the more he looked at the coffin, the more he realized that it wasn't just a symbol of wealth. It was a reminder of what he had sacrificed, and what he was about to sacrifice again. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Duro stood over the coffin, his hand trembling as he traced the ancient symbols carved into its surface. The air in the room grew heavy, and he could hear the faint whispers of the spirits calling to him. They wanted more. They wanted the final sacrifice to complete the ritual. They wanted the last piece of the puzzle. As Duro stood there, a cold sweat formed on his brow. He could hear his children's soft breathing in the next room, and for a fleeting moment, the love he felt for them swelled within him. How could he do this? How could he sacrifice one of them to fulfill his own selfish desires? The thought of taking one of their lives seemed unimaginable, yet the weight of the pact loomed over him. The ritual demanded it. The spirits demanded it. And then, in the silence of the night, Ton's voice pierced through Duro's thoughts. The boy, though only 10 years old, had gotten out of bed and was standing in the doorway, his eyes wide with fear. He had heard the whispers too, the ominous sound of his father's strange mutterings. The boy's presence startled Duro, and for a moment, he hesitated. He had not expected his son to be awake. But there was no turning back now. "Ton, what are you doing here?" Duro's voice was thick with guilt and desperation, but his son stood firm, his eyes full of determination. The boy had seen too much, heard too much. He had understood that something was wrong in the house. He could feel it in the air, the unnatural tension that filled the room. "I heard you, Father," Ton said, his voice trembling, but strong. "I know what you're planning to do. You've been acting strange for days. What are you going to do with us?" Duro felt a pang of shame as he looked at his son. This was his child, the one he had promised to protect, and yet here he was, standing at the crossroads of his own destruction. Duro had made a deal with forces beyond his understanding, and now his son was asking him to make a choice between wealth and love, between greed and family. The room fell into silence as the weight of the moment pressed down on them both. Ton's gaze never wavered, his innocence now lost to the knowledge of the horrors his father had summoned. And in that moment, Duro realized that no amount of wealth could ever replace the love of his children. The truth of his actions lay heavy on his soul, and he knew that there was no way to escape the consequences of the path he had chosen. But as the moonlight streamed through the window, Duro realized that the spirit would not let him off so easily. The deal was struck, and the forces he had unleashed were now beyond his control. The spirit had taken root in his life, and there would be no turning back from the darkness that had consumed him. As the full moon illuminated the quiet village, Duro found himself in a battle between his deepest desires and the horror of the reality he had created. He stood at the center of the room, gazing at the coffin, now a tangible manifestation of the ritual he had begun. It had been his one hope for wealth, for a life of luxury beyond his dreams. But what had once seemed like a pathway to fortune now felt like a deep abyss, pulling him further from the family he had once cherished. The wooden coffin was no longer just an object, it was a symbol of everything he had sacrificed to obtain his riches. The weight of his decision began to sink in. The rich crops and prosperous farm that had been growing under his command now seemed like mere illusions, promises made by an unseen force with a deadly price. He had made a deal with a spirit, and that spirit now demanded its payment. But what could he do? The night had come, and the ritual was set into motion. No one had suspected a thing. The village had no idea of the dark pact he had entered. No one knew the true reason for his sudden rise in wealth, and certainly no one could imagine the price he had been willing to pay. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps from the other room. It was Tond, his son. Tond had never shown the kind of suspicion that would have indicated he knew what was going on, but tonight, there was something in his eyes, a knowing that couldn't be ignored. Duro's heart beat faster, and a cold sweat covered his forehead. What had his son overheard? What had he sensed? "Father," Tond's voice was soft, but there was a sharpness to it. "What is happening?" Duro turned to face his son, his chest tightening. Tond stood at the doorway, his wide eyes filled with fear and confusion. Duro opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The guilt of what he was about to do crashed over him like a tidal wave. Tond was still too young, too innocent to understand the depth of what was happening. And yet, somehow, he seemed to understand more than Duro had anticipated. "Tond," Duro finally managed to whisper. "You shouldn't be here. Go back to bed." But Tond didn't move. Instead, he stepped into the room, his expression a mixture of fear and defiance. "I've heard the whispers, Father. I've seen the strange marks on the walls. I know what's going on." Duro's heart sank. Tond's words cut through him like a blade. How much had he seen? How much had he figured out? The thoughts raced through Duro's mind, but he couldn't bring himself to stop his son. Tond was too young to understand the true cost of what had been done. "I never meant for you to see this," Duro murmured, his voice shaking. "I wanted you to have everything. To have a life that was better than mine. That's all I ever wanted for you." Tond took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. "But this isn't what you promised. You promised us a family, a future. And now, I see, this isn't just about wealth. This is about something far darker." Duro felt a lump form in his throat. How had Tond figured it out so quickly? The guilt gnawed at him, making it hard to breathe. He had never intended for his son to bear witness to this horror. But now, as the reality of his actions pressed in on him, he knew that there was no escaping the consequences. Tond's voice shook with emotion as he spoke again. "Father, please stop. This isn't the way. The wealth, the power, it's not worth it. What about us? What about Mom?" Duro's heart broke as he looked at his son. Tond's words struck a chord deep within him. The realization hit Duro harder than any other feeling he had ever experienced. The price of his greed wasn't just affecting him. It was affecting his entire family. Tond, his beautiful wife Nia, and their two younger children had all been drawn into this nightmare, whether they realized it or not. "I'm sorry, Tond," Duro whispered, his voice breaking. "But it's too late. I've already made the deal. The spirits, they demand payment. They don't care about family. They only care about the price." Tond's face twisted with confusion and disbelief. "You didn't have to do this, Father. You didn't have to bring us into this. You didn't have to sacrifice us for your own desires. The words were like a slap to Duro's face. He had thought he could control the situation, that he could handle the consequences. But as he looked into Ton's eyes, he realized that his son was right. No amount of wealth could ever replace the love of his family. No riches could undo the damage he had done. "I'm sorry," Duro repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The guilt weighed heavier with every word, suffocating him. But just as the silence hung thick in the air, the spirit that had promised him riches began to stir. A cold wind blew through the room, and the lights flickered. The coffin before Duro seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The air itself felt charged, as if something was waking from a deep slumber. And that's when Duro realized the true cost of his actions. He had thought that once the ritual was complete, the spirit's power would be his to command. He believed the spirit would give him wealth and then disappear, satisfied with its payment. But the spirit had other plans. It wasn't just interested in fulfilling its end of the bargain. It wanted more. It wanted the family. Duro's words seemed to tilt as he watched the coffin begin to tremble. The spirit was not finished with its claim. And with that realization came the gut-wrenching truth: he had sealed his family's fate. There was no way to undo the damage. The ritual had bound him to the spirit, and now it would take from him what was most precious. As the spirit's energy grew stronger, Duro understood that the wealth he had gained would now come with a price he could never pay. The life he had taken for granted, the family he thought he could protect, would be lost to the darkness he had summoned. The winds howled, and the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. The night had come to an end, but it was only the beginning of the horror that awaited Duro and his family. The realization hit Duro like a thunderclap, sharp and deafening. The spirit he had summoned had not only claimed what it was owed, but it had begun to tighten its grip on his family, drawing them into its insidious grasp. The wind howled in the room, swirling in unnatural patterns, as if the very air around him was alive with malevolent force. The coffin, which had once seemed a simple vessel, now vibrated with a dark power. The spirits had awoken, and Duro could feel them, pulling at him, demanding more. In that moment, the full extent of his actions crashed down upon him. The wealth he had so eagerly pursued now seemed worthless, like sand slipping through his fingers. His children, his family, were the true price he had paid for his greed. He had sacrificed them to the spirit, thinking it was a small price to pay for untold riches. But now, it was clear that the spirit's price was far steeper than he had ever imagined. Ton stood beside him, his small face filled with both terror and disbelief. Duro looked at his son, and for the first time, he saw the depth of the damage he had done. Ton had always been a good boy, innocent, trusting. But now, Duro could see that the boy's childhood had been ripped away from him, replaced by a burden that no child should have to bear. The boy had seen too much, and in his eyes, Duro saw the flicker of fear that could never be erased. "Ton, I'm so sorry," Duro whispered, his voice cracking. He reached out to his son, but Ton recoiled, pulling away from him. "You did this, father," Ton said, his voice shaking with both anger and sorrow. "You brought us here. You sacrificed us for your own selfishness. You made a deal with something you didn't understand." Duro's heart broke at the words. He wanted to tell his son that he hadn't known. He wanted to explain that he had never meant for any of this to happen. But he knew deep down that it didn't matter. The damage was done. The spirits had taken their toll, and now they were demanding more. The room grew colder as the coffin began to tremble more violently. Duro could feel the pulse of the spirit, its power flowing through the room, filling every corner with its presence. He could hear the whispers now, faint at first but growing louder with each passing moment. The spirit was calling to him, beckoning him closer, urging him to complete the ritual. But Duro knew, deep within his soul, that there was no going back. He had crossed the line, and there was no turning around. As the whispers grew louder, Duro turned to Baba Yara, the village elder who had warned him of the consequences of dealing with the spirits. She had been right. She had seen the signs, and yet Duro had ignored her advice, driven only by his desire for wealth and success. Now, as the full moon bathed the room in eerie light, he realized that the consequences were far worse than he had ever anticipated. The spirit manifested in the room, its form shadowy and indistinct, but Duro could feel its presence in every fiber of his being. The air thickened as the spirit's power grew, the ground beneath him vibrating with energy. The entity was no longer a distant force, it was here, in the room, ready to claim its final prize. Duro could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the spirit was not going to let go. It had taken his wealth, it had taken his children's innocence, and now, it was coming for something else. He fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of what he had done. "Please," he begged, his voice breaking. "Please, I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know. Please forgive me." But the spirit was unmoved. It had no mercy, no forgiveness. It had been summoned by Duro's greed, and it would not leave until its demands were met. The spirit's form shifted, and it spoke in a voice that was both familiar and terrifying. "You knew what you were doing," the spirit's voice boomed. "You made the choice to invoke me. You believed that wealth could erase the consequences of your actions, but wealth is nothing. You have sacrificed what is most precious to you, and now you will pay the price." Tears filled Duro's eyes as he looked at the spirit, helpless and desperate. His life had been turned upside down, and there was no way to undo the damage. His wealth was nothing compared to the loss he felt, the loss of his own humanity, the loss of his family, and the loss of the life he had once dreamed of. "I failed them," Duro whispered, his voice barely audible. "I failed my children." The spirit's laughter echoed through the room, cold and unfailing. "You have failed, indeed. But now, you will learn the true cost of your choices. Your wealth means nothing. Your riches are but dust. You cannot buy back what you have lost. The damage is done, and you will never be the man you once were." The spirit's power surged again, and Duro felt himself being pulled toward it, as if invisible tendrils were wrapping around him. The coffin trembled, and the air became thick with dread. He wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The spirit had him in its grasp, and there was no escaping the consequences of his greed. Suddenly, Tom stepped forward, his small frame standing tall and resolute. "Father," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "You can still make this right. We can still stop this. The spirit can't take us if we stand together. We can break its hold." Duro looked at his son, stunned by his bravery. Turned, despite the fear in his eyes, was willing to fight for their family. In that moment, Duro saw the truth, it wasn't too late. He didn't have to face the spirit alone. He could fight for his family, for his children. And maybe, just maybe, they could undo the damage that had been done. With all the strength he could muster, Duro stood up, his eyes filled with determination. He would not let this spirit destroy everything he had left. The battle wasn't over yet, and he would do everything in his power to protect his family from the darkness he had brought upon them. The spirit, sensing the shift in Duro's resolve, let out a final, terrifying growl. It had been too long since it had encountered resistance. This would not be the end for Duro, but it was only the beginning of his redemption. The journey ahead would be long, and the consequences of his past would weigh heavily on him, but with his son by his side, Duro knew that there was still hope.